Which of the following is a typical you? You're in the shower and you're winning an argument that hasn't happened yet. Someone is going to say something to you, maybe next week, and you're already 3 replies deep, rehearsing the comeback, feeling your jaw tighten over words no one has actually said. Or you're lying awake running the conversation you have to have tomorrow, every way it could go wrong. Or you're replaying the thing you said in a meeting some 6 months ago, wincing all over again. The disaster that never came, the worst case that stayed hypothetical, the same dread, the same arguments, the same catastrophes on a loop, about things that have not happened and mostly never will. What you need to know is this: there's nothing wrong with you if any of that sounded like you. In fact, it's good. It is the single most successful survival strategy in the history of life on Earth. Picture 2 of your distant ancestors at the edge of a forest at dusk, back in the hunting and gathering days. The first hears a branch snap and thinks, probably nothing, and walks on. The second hears the same snap and instantly imagines the worst, a predator, crouched, waiting, and freezes, heart pounding, and backs away. Most nights, the second one is wrong and feels foolish and wastes the energy for nothing. But on the one night in 1,000 that something is in the dark, the optimist dies and the worrier lives. And the worrier is your ancestor. You are descended from 100,000 generations of the ones who assumed the worst and survived. The anxious brain won. It is, quite literally, why you are here. So the dread is not a defect. It's an inheritance. A threat detector tuned over millions of years to keep you alive, doing exactly what it was built to do. The problem isn't that you have it. The problem is the world you've been dropped into, one assembled piece by piece to keep that ancient detector firing all day, all night, at threats that will never actually arrive. A world that found your deepest survival instinct and learned to make money from it. This video isn't about how to calm down when you're anxious. It's about how the calm was taken from you, where the anxious feeling comes from, why the ancients felt it too and were never drowned by it, and how the modern world took an alarm meant to ring once in a great while and wired it to never switch off. I am the visual philosopher. Let's start with the alarm itself, and a simple question. What was all this fear ever for? Remember those 2 ancestors at the tree line. The one who shrugged and walked on, and the one who froze. The one who froze lived and passed the alarm down to you. But the story has a second half, and to see it, you have to leave the forest for open grassland, and an animal that carries the same alarm without the curse you carry beside it. A zebra is grazing in the morning sun, and a lion explodes out of the grass. In an instant, the zebra becomes a single machine built to escape. Its heart slams, adrenaline floods its muscles, sugar pours into its blood, and everything it doesn't need for running, digestion, hunger, even pain, quietly switches off. This is the same system that fires in you when you freeze at a sound in the dark, and for about 90 seconds, it is a thing of terrible beauty. The zebra runs, then it's over. The lion eats, or the zebra escapes. And if it escapes, something remarkable happens. Within minutes, it's grazing again, perfectly calm, the alarm already silent, as if nothing had happened. Hold on to that silence, because it's the half you don't have. A Stanford neurobiologist named Robert Sapolsky spent decades studying this system out among wild baboons and in the lab, and in 1994 he wrote it down in a book with a strange and perfect title, Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers. His point explains everything you felt in that shower. The stress response is a work of genius built for a single job. A short, sharp, physical emergency that ends the moment the danger passes. The zebra never lies awake replaying the lion. It can't. When the threat is gone, the alarm goes with it. You are the animal that breaks this rule. You have a mind that can imagine, so you can sit in a safe room and conjure a lion out of nothing. Next month's rent, tomorrow's difficult conversation, your own death 20 years away, and your body cannot tell the difference. It pours out the same chemistry for a frightening thought that the zebra's pours out for a real set of jaws. Sapolsky put it in a single line. Psychological stress is a recent invention. It's the same machinery behind the argument you rehearse in the shower and the conversation you dread at midnight. The survival alarm firing at a threat that lives only in your head, never finding the off switch the zebra has because there's no lion to outrun and be done with. Notice the gift in that before we reach the curse. The alarm isn't your enemy. It's the reason your ancestors lived long enough to make you. For almost the whole of human history, it behaved like the zebras. It fired when a real threat appeared, then fell quiet for days or weeks until the next one. It was built to be the exception. A rare, loud, life-saving interruption to a life that was otherwise calm, which makes the mystery sharper, not softer. An ancient system built for rare emergencies somehow became the permanent background of modern life. The alarm stopped switching off. The The question is when, and the first people to catch it happening were writing nearly 2,000 years ago. In Rome, around the year 60, the richest philosopher in the empire sat down to write to a friend, and he had every reason on earth to be afraid. His name was Seneca, tutor and advisor to the Emperor Nero, a man who would, a few years later, calmly send Seneca an order to open his own veins and die. Seneca lived inside real danger, the daily kind that ends with soldiers at your door. And yet, writing to his friend Lucilius, the thing he kept returning to wasn't the real danger at all. It was the imagined one. He'd noticed something about the mind that no amount of philosophy had ever cured, even in himself. We spend most of our suffering on things that never actually happen. He put it in a line that has lasted 2,000 years, because it's still exactly true. We suffer more in imagination than in reality. And just before it, the sharper version, the one fewer people know, there are more things likely to frighten us than there are to crush us. That is anxiety, named and diagnosed 2 millennia before the word for it existed. The dread of the thing, worse than the thing itself. A mind running ahead into a future that hasn't arrived, suffering it in advance and then again in memory, while the present, the only moment that's real, slips past unnoticed. The ancients knew this intruder well. The Stoics built half a philosophy to keep it in check, and the Buddhists, a world away, built another. Wherever human beings have thought carefully about the mind, they found the same thing waiting. One thing is worth saying plainly here. Anxiety is not new. It wasn't handed to us by phones or by capitalism. You would have felt it in a toga or a loincloth. Anyone who tells you it's purely a disease of our times is selling you something. But the ancients had one thing we've lost. They felt the alarm. They didn't live with it screaming every waking hour. Seneca could write about imagined fears precisely because, for most people, the imagining was occasional. A worry that rose and could be reasoned back down in a world that moved slowly, where the future stayed mostly out of sight, and the day in front of you filled your hands. The alarm was ancient and familiar. What didn't yet exist was a machine for pulling the trigger again and again without pause. That machine is modern, and it was built in 2 stages. The first moved the trigger inside you and handed you the job of pulling it. How did we end up flogging ourselves? For most of the industrial age, the thing driving you was easy to see because it stood over you holding a watch. Picture a factory floor 100 years ago. There's a foreman, and the foreman can fine you or simply throw you out the gate to starve. The bell rings, you work. It rings again, you stop. The pressure is total and it belongs to someone else, and everyone in the building knows it. A brutal arrangement, but it carries one strange mercy. When you walk out that gate at night, you're free for a few hours. The overseer can't follow you home. He stays at the factory. Now look at yourself. There's no foreman, no bell, no one forcing you to check email at 11 at night or answer a message on a Saturday or that you should somehow be doing more with your life. Yet you do it anyway, constantly. The pressure didn't vanish. It changed address. It climbed off the factory floor and into your own head, and up there it never clocks off. The thinker who mapped this is a South Korean-born, Berlin-based philosopher named Byung-Chul Han, and in 2015 he gave the New World its name, the Achievement Society. The old world ran on you must. External commands, external limits, an overseer saying no. The new one runs on you can. You can become anything. Limitless potential, the whole bright modern promise. And it sounds like freedom until you notice the trap folded inside it. If you can be anything, you're responsible for everything. If you can be anything and you end up tired and ordinary and struggling, there's no one left to blame but yourself. The no used to come from outside. Now the demand comes from within, and it has no ceiling because there's always more you could be. You become, in Han's phrase, your own overseer and your own victim. The achievement subject exploits itself until it burns out. There's no whip anymore because you've become the whip. You drive yourself harder than any foreman could because the foreman only wanted your labor, and what you want is for your whole self to be worthy, and that hunger has no closing bell. Worst of all is what it does to blame. Under the old system, when you suffered, you could be furious at the boss. Now you are the boss, and when the exhaustion arrives, there's no one to be angry at, and you simply get to feel like a failure. The exploiter is simultaneously the exploited. That's the first stage of the machine. It took the pressure that used to live out in the world and sealed it inside you, where you can never leave it at the gate again. But pressure from within isn't quite enough to keep the alarm screaming. For that, you need a fresh supply of things to fear, delivered all day long. Across the 20th century, we built exactly that. So who profits from your fear? In the 1960s, in an office at the University of Pennsylvania, a man began doing something nobody had thought to do. He started counting. His name was George Gerbner. Born in Hungary, he'd fled fascism and fought in the Second World War, and he had a personal reason to care about how a society builds its picture of the world. Year after year, he and his team cataloged American television, every program, and every act of violence inside it. Then they went out and asked ordinary people about reality. How dangerous is it out there? Can other people be trusted? What he found got a name: Mean World Syndrome. Heavy television viewers didn't see the real world. They saw television's world, which is far more violent and frightening than the one outside your door. They overestimated crime, trusted their neighbors less, and carried a bone-deep sense that the world was more menacing than any statistic could justify, and it barely mattered where they actually lived. The fear came from the screen, not the street. The numbers from one stretch of the 1990s are almost hard to believe. Across about 5 years, the American murder rate fell by roughly 13%, while coverage of murder on the network news rose by around 300%. The world grew safer, and its televised image grew bloodier at the very same time. You were shown more and more danger exactly as there was less and less of it. Gerbner understood something darker than an honest mistake. He understood who it serves. In 1981, he stood before the United States Congress and said it plainly. Fearful people are more dependent, more easily manipulated and controlled. A frightened population is profitable and easier to govern. Fear keeps you watching for the next threat, so you don't touch the dial. It sells you the insurance and the supplement. It wins the election for whoever promises to make the scary thing go away. Your anxiety isn't a glitch in the system. For a great many industries and interests, your anxiety is the system's product. The alarm in your chest became something other people harvest. And then, inside your own lifetime, Gerbner's television was handed a terrible upgrade. He died in 2005, just before the real machine arrived. The feed in your pocket is Mean World Syndrome with an engine bolted on. Not a single broadcast at 6 o'clock, but a bottomless, personalized scroll tuned by algorithms that learned long ago that whatever frightens or enrages you is whatever keeps you there. It serves you fear on purpose, hour after hour, because your attention is what's being sold. Seneca's world pulled once a week now gets pulled, gently, hundreds of times a day, by a machine in your hand that profits every time the alarm goes off. That's the second stage, and together the two of them finish the machine. Inside you, a voice insisting you must be more. Outside you, a screen insisting the world is coming for you. An ancient alarm wired to a button, and the button pressed without mercy from both directions, for somebody else's gain. So trace it back through the whole chain. Sapolsky found the alarm, the same one that froze your ancestor at the tree line. An ancient survival system built to fire once and fall silent. Seneca showed how old the feeling is, that humans have always suffered in imagination and always sensed they could suffer less. Hahn mapped the first wire, the pressure that climbed off the factory floor and into your head, where you became your own overseer with no closing bell. And Gerbner exposed the second, a screen that floods you with dangers that aren't there, because your fear pays nearly everyone but you. Put it together, and you can finally see what your anxiety actually is. It isn't a flaw in you, or a weakness, or proof that something inside you is uniquely broken, nor is it some eternal human fate you're condemned to carry. It's an ancient, healthy, life-saving alarm, living inside a world deliberately built to keep it ringing by people and systems that profit each time it does. You aren't malfunctioning. You're working perfectly in a place designed to set you off. And that is the good news, because it moves the problem out of you. If your anxiety were a defect in you, the fight would be lonely and probably hopeless. But it isn't in you. It's in the wiring around you. And wiring that was built can be seen for what it is and pulled apart. Sapolsky said it best, holding both halves of the truth in one breath. We are uniquely smart enough to have invented these stressors, and uniquely foolish enough to let them dominate our lives. Let them. That's the hinge of the whole sentence. Letting them is a choice, and a choice can be made the other way. None of this rests on a breathing exercise, though breathe if it helps. It rests on seeing the machine clearly enough to lift your hands off the buttons it's been pressing, noticing when the alarm is firing at a thought instead of a lion, and letting it pass without obeying, starving the feed that feeds on your dread, quietly refusing the voice that says you must be everything, and remembering that nobody who ever found peace got there by becoming more. The world will keep reaching for the alarm in your chest. It was built to. But once you can see the hand reaching, you don't have to flinch every time it moves. Your ancestors carried this same alarm for 1,000,000 years and were never ruled by it. The alarm was never the enemy. The world we wired around it is, and that, unlike your own racing heart, is something we're allowed to change.